So make sure that you are following along as we are practicing rounding numbers using place value. So remember, we're going to round using place value. We're going to round to the nearest 10 and the nearest 100. Your success criteria is that I can explain which digit I use to round and why. I can identify which 10 or 100 is closest to a number, and I can round a number to the nearest 10 or nearest 100. All right, so yesterday we practiced this with a number line. Plot the number, round the number to the nearest 10 and to the nearest 100. So we're rounding 376. So if I'm going to round 376, I'm going to round to the nearest 10. 376 on my number line is going to go somewhere right here, right? So if I round it to the nearest 10, which 10 is it closest to? 370 or 380? Well, the closest 10 would be 380. All right. Now, if I'm going to round to the nearest 100, the nearest 100 is between 300 and 400. Again, it's still in the same spot. So which one is it closest to? So it's closest to 400 because it's closest to 400, which is the closest 100. All right, let's look at the next one, 343. Let's put 343 on the number line. It's going to be somewhere in here. All right, so rounding to the nearest 10, I'm going to be looking at 340 or 350. Well, this shows me that it is actually closest to 340 when it's rounded to the nearest 10. All right, and if I'm rounding to the nearest 100, again, I'm going to look at the 300 and the 400. If I round 343, rounded to the nearest 100, if you look, this one is actually closest to 300. So I'm going to round to 300. All right, turn to the next page. How can you round the number without using a number line? Well, remember how we talked yesterday about if I know certain rules, if I know that I'm looking at a number and if it's 4 or less, I'm going to let it rest. If it's 5 or more, I'm going to add one more. I'm going to round up. Okay, so let's practice this. So again, find the place to which you are rounding. Look at the digit to the right. If it is less than 5, then the digit in the place you are rounding stays the same. And this is what we were just looking at on the other slide. If it is 5 or greater, then the digit in the place you are rounding increases by 1. That's that part of add 1. And you write zeros for the digits to the right of the place you are rounding. So remember how I said, if I'm rounding to the nearest 10, I have to end in 1 0. If I'm rounding to the nearest 100, I should end in 2 zeros. All right, let's practice this. So I'm going to round 68 to the nearest 10. So I'm going to look at the tens place. Okay, this is the number that I am rounding. Okay, the 8 is the number that I'm going to look at. So I'm going to draw a circle around it because this is the number I'm looking at. So I'm trying to circle it, making it look like an eyeball. That's the number I'm going to look at to tell me what I'm going to do with that 6. Well, I know that 8 is greater than 5, so that means that I'm going to round up, right? But I'm not rounding the 8 up, I'm rounding the 6 up. So the 6 becomes a 7 and the 8 becomes a 0. Because remember what I said, when you're rounding to the nearest 10, you have to have a 0 at the end. And so I'm going to have a 0, so the 8 becomes a 0. And also by drawing the circle, that lets me know that like an eyeball, right? This looks like an eyeball. I'm going to look at this number, but it also tells me by drawing this circle around it that this number is the number that's going to become a 0. All right, so 68 rounded to the nearest 10 is going to be 70. Round 235 to the nearest 10 and to the nearest 100. Well, if I'm rounding 235 to the nearest 10, I don't have to do anything to the 2 because that's in the hundreds place. So what I'm going to look at is the number that's in the tens place. The tens place is a 3. The 3 is the number that I'm going to change. So I'm going to leave my 2 And now I'm going to look at my 5. Remember, draw a circle around it. This is the number I'm looking at. That number is a 5. That 5 tells me that I am going to make the 3 become a 4. And the 5 now becomes a 0. So 235 rounded to the nearest 10 is 240. All right, and the next one, I'm rounding to the nearest 100. So on this one, I'm actually changing the number that's in the hundreds place. So I'm going to look at the 3. Draw your circle around the number you're looking at. I'm going to look at the 3. The 3 tells me that I am going to leave my 2. That the 3, remember the talking about the rounding, if it's 4 or less, let it rest. That 2 is going to stay. That 3 is now going to become a 0. The 5 also becomes a 0. So rounding 235 to the nearest 10 or nearest 100 is 200. All right, let's practice with rounding to the nearest 10. So again, I'm going to look at the 1. The 1 tells me to do what? Let's look over here at our chart, right? The 1 tells me to do what? Let the 4 rest. So my 4 is going to rest. My 1 becomes a 0. So 41 rounded to the nearest 10 is 40. All right, let's look at the next one. 85. Circle the 5. The 5, I look at the 5. The 5 tells the 8. So again, let's look over here. The 5 is going to tell the 8 to become a 9 because it's 5 or more. Let you add one more. Okay, so I'm going to add 1 to the 8 and it becomes a 9 and my 5 becomes a 0. All right, let's look at the next number, 153. Again, I'm going to look at the 3. I'm changing the 5 or I'm leaving it alone. So if I look, 3, again over here, if I look over here, 3 is on here and that says let it rest. So my 5, my 1 and my 5 are going to stay the same and my 3 becomes a 0. So round to the nearest 10, 153 is 150. Round to the nearest 100, okay? Same idea. I'm going to look at the 4. The 4 tells my 7 to rest, right? Looking over here, it tells my 7 to rest. So my 7 is going to stay the same, and all my other numbers have zeros at the end. Now remember, if I'm rounding to the nearest 100, I'm going to have how many zeros at the end every single time? 2. I'm always going to have 2 zeros at the end when I round to the nearest 100. All right, let's look again at 372. I'm going to look at the 7. The 7, if I look right here, the 7 tells the 3 to become a 4, and all the other numbers become a 0. Remember again, I'm rounding to the nearest 100, so I have to have 2 zeros at the end. All right, here I'm going to look at my 4. My 4 is I'm sorry, not 4. I'm going to look at the 9 because I'm rounding to the nearest 100. That 9 tells the next number, which is not there, but it tells the 9 to become a 1. It actually becomes a 10, which is 100, okay? So I'm rounding to the nearest 100 here. It would be 100. All right, let's practice again. Round the number to the nearest 10. If I look here, I have 17. I'm going to look at the 7. The 7 tells the 1 to become a 2, and the 7 becomes a 0. Now remember, when I'm rounding to the nearest 10, how many zeros do I have to have at the end? 1. If I'm rounding to the nearest 100, I have to have 2. So now let's look at number 8. If I look at number 8, the 2 tells the 5 to do what? Well, if I look over here, the 2 is going to tell the 5 to rest. And then the 2 becomes a 0. So 52 rounded to the nearest 10 will be 50. 79. I'm going to look at the 9. The 9 is going to tell that 7. If I look right here, what does that 9 tell that 7 to do? Become an 8. And then what do I put at the end? A 0. 673 rounded to the nearest 10. That 3 is going to tell that 7 to rest. The 6 is going to stay the same. I don't need to mess with that. So 6, 7, and then I'm going to end with a 0. So 670 is what round 673 is rounded to the nearest 10. All right, let's look at number 11. Look at the 1. The 1 tells the 2 to rest. So 5 and 2 are going to stay the same. And that 1 becomes a 0. Remember again, if I'm rounding to the nearest 10, I have to have a 0, 1, 0 at the end. 208. If I look at that 8, the 8 is going to tell that 0 to become a 1. And my 8 becomes a 0. Again, you're rounding to the nearest 10. You must have 1 0 at the end. All right, round to the nearest 100. I'm going to do a couple with you, and then I want you to do the rest on your own. 161, I'm going to look at the 6. The 6 is going to tell that 1 to become a 2, right? If I look here, 6 tells that 1 to become a 2. Okay? The rest of the numbers become 0 because remember, if I'm rounding to the nearest 100, I have to have 2 zeros. Number 14, I'm going to look at the 3. The 3 is going to tell that 7 to rest, and the other numbers become 0. All right, I want you to try doing 15 through 18 on your own. Once you're done, pause the video. Once you're done, come back to the video and continue. All right, round the number to the nearest 10 and to the nearest 100. I want you to practice doing this on your own. Pause the video, do number 19 and 20, and I'm going to do number 21 with you. All right, so we're back together. Let's look at number 21. Rounded to the nearest 10, I'm going to look here. That 2 is going to tell that 7 to rest. So rounded to the nearest 10 is 70. Now 72 on a number line, if I looked at 72 on a number line, I'm going to have 0 at one end and 100 at the other end, okay? So 72 rounded to the nearest 100 would be 100. All right, we're going to skip number 22. Let's look at number 23. Select all the numbers that round to 400 when rounded to the nearest 100. Okay, so let's look. We're just going to go through and see would it round to 400. Well, if I look at the 5 is going to tell that 3 to become a 4, and the rest of the numbers become 400. So A would be a good choice. Here, the 8 would tell the 4 to become a 5, and this would be 500. That would not be a good choice. The 3 would tell the 4 to stay, and the rest of the numbers would become 0. So, yes, this would be a good one because that would be 400. Move on to D. 1 would tell the 3 to rest, so this would be 300. E, the 4 would tell the 3 to rest, and the rest would be 0, so that would be 300. And F, the last one, the 4 would tell the 4 to rest, and the rest would become 0, so that would be the answer choice. But I want you to notice I had to work out and solve every single one on here. So make sure that you realize when it says select all, it means work all of them. All right, I want you to pause the video again. Try doing these on your own. All right, now we are at the Blooket. I'm going to actually add it into the Nearpod so you can go in and review. Make sure that you have down rounding.